She wasn't expecting to see him that day. Alara was sitting at a small cafe table with her 2 children beside her, crayons scattered between their juice glasses. A quiet afternoon, nothing extraordinary, until the door opened and Kai walked in. Their eyes locked across the room. He took a step toward her, gaze dropping to the little boy and girl coloring at her side. His voice was barely a whisper, but it hit like a thunderclap. "They're mine. Have you ever loved someone so deeply you believed they could never be the one to break you? The kind of love where you give your youth, your dreams, and your faith without ever thinking it could be betrayed." Before I take you into this unforgettable story, make sure you tap that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because this is one story you will feel all the way to your bones, and you won't want to miss the moments ahead. What if the person who shattered your heart wasn't just your partner, but also the friend you trusted more than anyone? This is the story of a woman who built her life from nothing, only to watch it crumble at the hands of the 2 people she thought would never hurt her. It's also the story of how she found the strength to rise, protect her children, and open her heart again, but to someone who truly deserved it. That afternoon in the cafe, Kai pulled out the chair across from her. His eyes searched hers for a softness that no longer lived there. Years earlier, those same eyes had looked at her as though she were the only thing in the world worth seeing. She still remembered the nights in their penthouse when he'd come home late, loosen his tie, and gather her into his arms without saying a word. The way his hands would trace the curve of her back, his lips brushing hers in a kiss that lingered just long enough to make her forget the noise of the world. Their love had been physical, yes, but it was more than that. It was the quiet electricity of 2 people who could speak without words, the way their breathing fell into rhythm under the same blanket, the way they fit together as if nothing else made sense. But all of that was before the lies, before the betrayal that would cut deeper than she ever thought possible. This is where our story begins, and by the time we reach the end, you'll see why sometimes forgiveness is not about repairing what was broken, but about setting yourself free. Her skin still remembered the warmth of his hands that night. They hadn't spoken for minutes, not because there was nothing to say, but because silence felt richer than words. The lights of the city glimmered through the glass, casting a gentle glow across the room. Kai's heartbeat was steady under her cheek, his scent wrapping around her like a promise she thought would last forever. "Stay like this," he whispered, his voice low enough that it vibrated against her temple. She smiled without opening her eyes. "I'm not going anywhere." He shifted, pulling her even closer until there was no space left between them. His fingers traced slow lines across her back, not hurried, not demanding, just memorizing her. The way his lips brushed hers then was how he always kissed her when it mattered most, unhurried, reverent, as though she were something rare. That tenderness wasn't born in a penthouse. It had started years earlier, in the most unlikely place, a narrow bookstore on a quiet street. She had been browsing the shelves when she noticed him in the corner, staring down at a worn marketing manual like it was his last hope. His suit looked slept in, his shoes had seen better days, and yet there was an intensity in his eyes that made her pause. They spoke over coffee upstairs, about ideas, about ambition, about how no one believed in the company he wanted to build. His words carried the kind of hunger you couldn't fake. She didn't know it then, but she would become part of that fight. In the months that followed, she saw every shade of his struggle. Nights when he'd come home defeated after another rejection, she would pull him into her arms until the tension left his shoulders. Mornings when he doubted himself, she'd stand in front of him and remind him exactly who he was. They made rent by cutting corners, skipped luxuries most people took for granted, and celebrated tiny victories like they were impossible miracles. The turning point came one night when he walked in looking like the world had finally given him a break. "Dance with me," he said suddenly, no explanation. "There's no music," she teased. "Then we'll make our own." They stood barefoot on the living room floor, moving to a rhythm that belonged only to them. Her laughter melted into his shoulder, his breath warmed her hair. In that moment, it didn't matter how small their apartment was or how uncertain the future seemed. They were building something bigger than success. They were building them. Now, years later, wrapped in the quiet glow of their penthouse, she thought about how far they had come. His company was thriving. Their home was everything they had once dreamed of. And when he kissed her that night, slow, deep, with his hand cradling her jaw, she felt certain they had weathered every storm together. She had no idea another one was on its way. That night, dinner had been simple: roasted chicken, a glass of his favorite wine, and the kind of unhurried conversation they hadn't had in weeks. They lingered at the table long after the plates were empty, her toes brushing his under the table, his gaze never drifting away from her face. "You know what I miss?" he said, leaning back with a smirk that was more affectionate than playful. "What?" "Having you all to myself. No calls, no meetings, no clock ticking in my head. Just you." She reached for his hand, running her thumb over his knuckles. "Then take me," she whispered. He didn't need more than that. In a single smooth movement he stood, pulling her into his arms. She laughed softly as her feet left the floor, his strength carrying her to the bedroom. The world outside ceased to exist. His jacket fell to the floor first, then her sweater, each touch slower than the last, as though they were unwrapping something precious. The city lights spilled across the bed, painting their skin in a warm glow. His lips explored hers with the same devotion as always, slow, lingering, as though memorizing every breath, every sigh. When they finally lay tangled together, hearts racing, she traced circles on his chest with the tip of her finger. He caught her hand and kissed her palm, holding it there against his heart. "You know," he murmured, "no matter what happens out there, this will always be my favorite place to be." She believed him. The days that followed seemed to hum with that closeness. They shared morning coffee in bed, her head resting on his shoulder while he read the news. He called her from the office, just to hear her voice, and every evening he came home with the kind of tired smile that belonged only to her. But life had been whispering a new chapter into her ear, one she hadn't told him about yet. It started with the few mornings where she felt lightheaded, a fatigue that clung to her no matter how much she rested. She thought it was the stress of keeping up with his schedule, but something in her heart nudged her toward the truth. The doctor's words had been soft but life-altering. "Congratulations, you're having twins." She'd walked out of that clinic holding the ultrasound photo against her chest, as if keeping the tiny lives inside her safe from the world. On the ride home, her mind spun with the perfect way to tell him. That night, she ordered his favorite wine, lit the candles he loved, and placed a small white box in the center of the table. Inside were 2 tiny white baby shoes, a ribbon tying them together. She rehearsed the moment in her mind, the way his eyes would widen, the way his arms would lift her off the ground, the way he'd promise her they were ready for this, together. She didn't know her perfect reveal would never happen. The dining table was set like it was waiting for a story to unfold. Candles flickered in soft amber light, casting a warm glow over the plates she'd arranged just so. The small white box with the baby shoes sat in the center, wrapped in a delicate ribbon. Every detail felt intentional. This was more than dinner. It was the beginning of a new life for them both. Alara kept glancing at the clock, listening for the sound of his key in the door. She had imagined his reaction so vividly that it almost felt real. The shock, the joy, the way he'd pull her in so tightly she could barely breathe. Her phone buzzed. It was Kai. "Another emergency meeting," he said, his tone clipped and hurried. "I'll be late." "Don't wait up." She tried to keep the disappointment from her voice. "It's okay. We'll talk tomorrow." When the call ended, she stared at the candles, the box, the empty place across from her. She told herself it was just bad timing. CEOs had unpredictable schedules. But it wasn't just that night. In the days that followed, the small shifts became impossible to ignore. He guarded his phone, turning the screen away when messages appeared. Calls were taken in hushed tones from the balcony. He came home later and later, sometimes smelling faintly of a perfume she didn't wear. At first, she reasoned it away. Stress, long hours, high-stakes deals. She'd been there before, in those early years when sleep was a luxury and every day felt like a race. But this was different. It wasn't just the late nights. It was the way his eyes seemed elsewhere, even when he was right in front of her. One evening, she tried to bridge the growing gap. She walked up behind him in the kitchen, wrapping her arms around his waist, like she had so many times before. "We hardly see each other lately," she said softly. He hesitated before turning to face her. "Things are complicated at work." His voice was gentle, but his embrace didn't linger. That night she lay in bed awake long after he fell asleep beside her. She pressed a hand to her stomach, feeling the faint swell that was starting to form, and whispered to the little lives inside her, "You'll know love. Whatever happens, I promise you'll know love." She decided she'd wait a few more days, until the perfect moment returned. After all, some news deserved to be told in joy, not through exhaustion. She didn't realize the window for that moment was closing faster than she could see. It started so quietly, she almost convinced herself it wasn't real. A dinner moved to another night, a call he didn't answer until hours later. Little things. But little things have a way of becoming patterns. Kai had always been a man who made time for her, no matter how demanding his schedule became. Now, the warmth in his voice during those evening calls was fading. Sometimes the calls didn't come at all. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, she leaned toward him to glance at his phone. He tilted it away, almost reflexively. "I was just checking the time," she said with a small laugh. He gave her a half smile. Work stuff. He wouldn't be interested. That was the first time something sharp tugged at her chest. The next change came quietly but left a mark, a faint scent clinging to his jacket. Not hers. She'd noticed it once, then twice, and by the third time she could no longer pretend it was coincidence. Still, she tried to rationalize it. A handshake, a quick greeting at a meeting. She knew how easy it was to pick up traces of another person without meaning to. But deep down, a part of her was already bracing for something she didn't want to see. She thought about the man he used to be, the one who stayed up late to help her assemble cheap furniture in their first apartment, who once walked halfway across the city to bring her soup when she was sick, who held her like she was the most important thing in his world. That man wouldn't keep secrets, but there was distance now, and it was growing. One Saturday morning, Alara decided to reclaim something simple, breakfast together. She set the table with his favorite omelet, fresh juice, and still warm bread. The smell filled the kitchen, a quiet invitation to linger. Kai came down the stairs already in his suit, phone in hand, his steps quick. "I've got a meeting at 10, he said, glancing at the clock. "You have time to eat," she said softly, motioning to the table. He paused, looked at her for a second longer than usual, then bent to kiss her cheek. "I'll grab something later." She watched him leave, the untouched plate cooling in front of his empty chair. It wasn't just the skipped breakfast. It was the way his mind seemed somewhere else entirely. Later that afternoon, she met Ariane for lunch. They'd been friends since college, the kind of friendship that survived moves, relationships, and late-night phone calls about nothing. "You've been quiet today," Ariane said, leaning forward, concern in her eyes. Alara hesitated. "Kai's just different lately. Different how? I don't know. Distant. Distracted." Ariane squeezed her hand. "You know how much pressure he's under. This will pass." It was a reasonable answer, but it didn't lift the weight pressing on Alara's chest. That night she sat at the kitchen counter, pretending to scroll through her phone when Kai walked in. His tie was loosened, hair slightly tousled, phone still in his hand. "You're up," he said. "I wanted to see you." He crossed to her, kissed her quickly, and muttered something about an early morning. His embrace was brief, polite almost. Later, lying beside him in the dark, Alara kept her eyes open, tracing the ceiling with her gaze. Her hand found the gentle curve of her stomach, where the twins shifted faintly. She whispered to them in a voice that trembled more than she intended. "You'll always know love, no matter what." A voice inside her wanted to believe she was overthinking, that love was enough to keep two people tethered. But another voice, smaller, sharper, was asking the question she didn't dare speak aloud. What if he's already gone and I'm the last to know? What would you do if you started noticing these signs? Comment below. I want to know your thoughts. It was a quiet Saturday when Alara decided she wasn't going to wait around at home anymore. She'd been feeling the twins move more each day, and the thought of sharing a simple lunch with Kai, just the two of them, felt like the perfect way to close the distance that had been growing. She packed his favorite lunch from the little bistro down the street, the one they used to go to before Arden International was even more than a dream. She pictured his surprise, the way his shoulders would drop, his eyes would soften when he saw her. The lobby of his building was polished and still, the kind of quiet that makes every step sound too loud. She greeted the receptionist, who smiled politely but seemed hesitant when Alara mentioned she'd be heading up to his floor. The elevator ride felt longer than usual, each floor passing in slow, measured beeps. She held the paper bag close, the smell of fresh bread and roasted chicken drifting upward. When the doors opened, the hum of the office greeted her, the faint clatter of keyboards, the low murmur of voices from behind glass walls. She turned toward the corner, Suite, where Kai's office overlooked the city. Her steps slowed. Something in the air felt off, not the bad kind of off she'd imagined in the middle of sleepless nights, but the kind that tells you you're about to see something you can't unsee. Through the tall glass panes, she could see him. His jacket was off, shirt sleeves rolled up. He wasn't at his desk. Alara took a step forward, her mind trying to make sense of the shapes and shadows before her. She'd always thought if she ever saw something suspicious, her body would react instantly, confront, demand answers. But her feet stayed rooted. The woman leaned in, her hair falling forward, and then Alara saw his mouth on hers. It felt as though the air had been knocked out of her lungs. Her first thought wasn't rage, it was disbelief. Her second was recognition. The hair, the tilt of her head, the familiar curve of her smile. It wasn't just anyone. It was Ariane. Alara's breath caught so sharply she had to press her free hand against her chest. Her fingers tightened around the paper bag until it crumpled. Through the glass, Kai's hand slid into Ariane's hair, pulling her closer. It wasn't a fleeting kiss, not a careless brush of lips. It was deliberate, familiar. The kind of kiss a man gives when he's certain he wants the woman in front of him. Then came the sound that split her in two. Ariane laughed, not just any laugh. The one Alara had heard on countless nights over wine and takeout. The laugh that used to light up their dorm room during late study sessions. The laugh she had trusted like family. Alara stood frozen, 1,000 memories flashing through her mind. Ariane helping her choose her wedding dress. Ariane holding her hand through heartbreaks before Kai. Ariane toasting them on their anniversary. The two people she had trusted most were standing in front of her, touching as if she had never existed. She didn't push open the door. She didn't shout or demand an explanation. Some betrayals don't deserve an audience. Her throat felt tight, the kind of tightness that comes before a sob, but she swallowed it down. She turned, forcing her legs to carry her toward the elevator, even as her vision blurred. The weight of the paper bag in her hand felt ridiculous now, as if bringing him lunch could fix what she had just seen. The elevator ride down was a blur. She stared at the glowing numbers, her pulse thundering in her ears, every floor feeling like it would never come soon enough. By the time the door slid open into the lobby, she had pulled her shoulders back, forcing her face into something calm, something unreadable. The receptionist offered her a polite nod, unaware that Alara's world had just shifted into something unrecognizable. Outside, the air felt colder than she remembered. She walked without really knowing where she was going, each step heavy with the knowledge that her marriage, the life she had built over years of sacrifice and devotion, had just ended without a single word spoken. As she made her way home, a thought kept circling in her head. Trust isn't just about believing someone won't hurt you. It's about knowing they wouldn't want to. Kai had wanted to. Ariane had wanted to. That was enough to answer every question she could ever ask. All right, Emmanuel, here's Act 2, Section 3, Double Blow, keeping the tone heavy, personal, and gut-wrenching without repeating earlier beats. Act 2, The Betrayal, Double Blow. 2 weeks passed. 2 weeks of silence from Kai, except for the occasional practical text about bills or mail. 2 weeks of Alara avoiding places where she might see Ariane. 2 weeks of carrying the twins inside her, while carrying something far heavier in her chest. She had decided not to tell anyone what she had seen. Not yet. There was no strength to spare for explanations, no energy for other people's shock or pity. She went about her days quietly, answering work emails, folding laundry, cooking simple meals, but every small task felt like she was moving through water. On a Wednesday morning, the news reached her in the cruelest way. She was at the grocery store, reaching for a carton of milk, when she heard two women talking in the next aisle. Did you hear? Ariane's pregnant. With Kai Arden's baby, no less. They're not even trying to hide it. The words landed like a physical blow. Alara gripped the handle of the cart until her knuckles whitened. She stayed still, hidden behind a row of cereal boxes, listening to the rest of the conversation. Talk of how happy Ariane looked, how lucky she was, how Kai must be over the moon. Over the moon. She blinked hard, because the only pregnancy Kai didn't know about was her own. The twins shifted faintly inside her, as if they could sense the change in her breathing. He had celebrated another woman's child while knowing nothing about his own. It wasn't just betrayal anymore, it was erasure. She left the store without finishing her shopping. At home, she sat at the kitchen table with the ultrasound photo in her hands, two tiny profiles side by side, floating in the grainy black and white. They were real. They were his. And yet, they were hers alone. Her mind flickered through what-ifs. What if she'd told him earlier? What if that night's dinner had gone as planned? What if the person he had chosen to hold close had been her instead of Ariane? But what-ifs were useless now. The truth was set. For the first time, she felt the anger she'd been too numb to reach before. Not the kind that screams or throws dishes, the kind that sharpens into clarity. She would not fight for space in the life he had chosen without her. That night, Alara didn't wait for him to come home. She moved through the penthouse with a calmness that surprised her. No slammed doors, no shouting, just the soft sound of drawers opening, the whisper of hangers sliding along the rail. She folded each piece of clothing carefully, stacking them into the suitcase laid open on the bed. The ultrasound photos went in last, tucked between layers of fabric where they wouldn't bend. She didn't take much, only what she needed, only what was hers. In the living room, the small white box still sat on the shelf where she'd placed it weeks ago, its ribbon untouched. She picked it up, held it for a moment, then set it gently in the center of the dining table. Beside it, she placed a single sheet of paper. Her handwriting was steady. Some betrayals don't deserve a second chance. She left the keys next to the note and glanced around the room one last time. This had once been a place filled with laughter and late-night conversations, with the warmth of shared dreams. Now it was just an address. When she stepped into the hallway, the click of the door behind her felt final. Some endings don't come with fireworks or grand scenes. Some arrive quietly, like the closing of a book you'll never read again. If you believe walking away is sometimes the strongest choice, share this video. Someone out there needs to hear this. The first night in her new place felt heavier than she expected. No distant hum of the penthouse elevator, no muffled footsteps from another room, just stillness. The townhouse was small, its walls carrying the faint scent of fresh paint from the quick touch-ups done before she moved in. A single suitcase sat at the foot of her bed. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Pregnancy alone was a different kind of journey. She woke in the early hours with aches she couldn't shift away, shifting from side to side until the twins settled. Mornings brought nausea without anyone there to hold her hair or bring her something light to eat. Some days, loneliness crept in quietly. The empty chair across the table at breakfast, the quiet evenings when she had no one to share the twins' newest movements with. She would place her hand over the growing curve of her stomach and speak softly to them. She told them about her day, about the weather, about how much they were already loved. Money, however, was a constant shadow. She kept a notebook filled with numbers, each calculation a reminder that savings only stretched so far. Rent, groceries, utilities. It was all a careful balancing act. When the reality became too sharp, she began selling jewelry she'd collected over the years. Each piece held a story, a necklace from an anniversary, earrings worn to a special event. Letting them go was bittersweet, but the cash meant keeping the lights on a little longer. In the quiet of those evenings, she started to think about what came next. If she was going to give her children stability, she needed something more than survival. She needed a plan. The idea came quietly, not in a flash, but in the way she noticed what was already around her. Even in the smallest apartment she and Kai had once shared, she had loved shaping a space, shifting furniture until it felt balanced, adding colors that made the air seem lighter, creating corners where people wanted to linger. Friends had often told her she had an eye for it. Now, sitting at her small kitchen table, she wondered if that skill could become something more than a compliment. She pulled out a notebook and began sketching. Layouts, fabric swatches, ways to transform plain rooms into spaces that felt personal. It wasn't just about style, it was about making a room feel like it could hold someone's life. She began researching suppliers and small business resources. Her laptop stayed open late into the night as she worked through how she could start with almost nothing. Finally, she listed a few basic services online, refreshing a living room, organizing workspaces, setting up cozy dining areas for families. The first month brought only one inquiry, a woman who needed her dining area prepared for a holiday dinner. The payment wouldn't change her life, but she took the job with full attention, measuring, painting, and placing every detail with care. When the woman walked in to see the finished space, her eyes filled with tears. "It's exactly what I hoped for," she whispered. That moment gave Alara something she hadn't felt in weeks. Proof that she could still create beauty, even when her own life felt broken. Proof that she could stand on her own. That night, she used the payment to buy groceries without touching her savings. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The second client came from word of mouth. The woman whose dining room she had transformed posted photos online, tagging Alara's name with a glowing review. Within days, 3 more inquiries arrived. One was a young couple wanting to turn a cramped apartment into a home for their first baby. Another was a small cafe owner desperate to make his space more welcoming. Each project was modest in budget, but each gave her the same satisfaction, walking into a blank, lifeless space and leaving it ready for new memories. She worked from her kitchen table, rolls of fabric leaning against the wall, her laptop surrounded by open color charts and sample books. The twins kicked off, and now, sometimes so strongly she had to pause mid-sentence when speaking to a client. She'd rest her hand over her stomach and smile, knowing they were part of this journey with her. Her days found a rhythm. In the mornings she made calls, sent proposals, and chased suppliers. Afternoons were for site visits or hands-on work, painting, arranging furniture, hanging artwork. Evenings were quieter, spent sketching new ideas while the twins turned her belly into their own little world. By the time she was 8 months along, she had completed 6 projects. The extra income meant she no longer had to sell anything just to make it through the month. She even allowed herself one small indulgence, a second-hand armchair upholstered in soft gray fabric. It sat by the window in her bedroom, waiting for late-night feedings and story times. Every success, no matter how small, felt like a milestone. She marked them in her notebook. First client, first repeat customer, first referral from someone I've never met. She realized she was building more than a business. She was building a new version of herself, one who didn't wait for permission to move forward, one who could meet challenges without flinching. When the twins arrived, life shifted again, this time in a way that filled her home with sound and movement. Callan and Sylvie came into the world healthy and strong, their cries announcing not just their presence, but the start of a new chapter. The first weeks were a blur of feedings, sleepless nights, and learning to juggle 2 infants at once. There were moments of exhaustion so deep she thought she'd sink into it, but then one of them would curl a tiny fist around her finger, and the fatigue would melt into something else entirely, gratitude. Her work paused for a short while, but not her momentum. Clients who had already hired her sent flowers and messages of congratulations. A few even told her to call when she was ready. They'd wait for her. That loyalty became a quiet reassurance, proof she was doing something right. By the twins' first birthday, she was back to taking on more projects, now with a small team of 2 assistants. They handled deliveries, scheduled meetings, and managed the heavier labor so Alara could focus on design and client relationships. She began renting a small studio space, bright and open, where samples lined the walls and a long work table sat in the center. The twins often played in a corner on a soft rug, their laughter echoing through the room as she worked. Business milestones came steadily. Her first large-scale renovation, her first feature in a local magazine, her first month where she turned down more projects than she accepted. Each success was a reminder of how far she'd come from that first lonely night in the townhouse. But the greatest joy came in the everyday moments, watching the twins race each other down the hall, their giggles chasing away any lingering shadows from the past, cooking dinner while they sat at the counter, coloring and telling her about their day, tucking them into bed, their heads resting on pillows she had chosen and arranged herself. Her life was full again, not with the kind of luxury she had once known, but with something far richer, stability, purpose, and the quiet certainty that she had built it all with her own hands. It happened on an evening she almost didn't attend. A friend from the design community had invited her to a charity art auction, saying it would be a good place to meet potential clients. Alara hesitated. Her days were long, and the idea of small talk with strangers felt like more effort than reward, but something in her told her to go. The gallery was softly lit, the air filled with quiet conversation and the faint scent of coffee from a corner table. She was standing near a display of abstract paintings when she heard a voice beside her. "Do you see the sailboat?" She turned to find a man in a simple navy blazer, his hair slightly tousled as if he'd been caught in a breeze. He was looking at the same painting she was, a swirl of color and texture with no obvious subject. "I'm not sure it's a sailboat," she said, tilting her head. "Exactly," he replied with a small smile. "It's whatever you decide it is." His name was Theo. He wasn't flashy and he didn't rush to fill the silence. They began talking about the pieces on display, about books they'd read, about how coffee always tasted better in mismatched mugs. The conversation flowed easily, without the subtle undercurrent of performance she had grown used to with Kai. Theo didn't try to impress her with titles or stories meant to make himself larger. Instead, he listened, really listened. When she spoke, his eyes stayed on hers, his attention steady and unhurried. By the end of the evening, they'd exchanged numbers, not in the way of people checking a box, but with the quiet promise of wanting to continue the conversation. That night, as she tucked the twins into bed, she found herself thinking about his calm presence. It wasn't excitement that stayed with her, but something deeper, the feeling of having been seen without having to ask for it. Their first date wasn't dinner at a high-end restaurant or tickets to an exclusive event. It was a walk by the river at dusk. Theo arrived with 2 takeaway cups of coffee, one exactly the way she liked it, somehow remembered from their conversation at the auction. The air was cool, and the sound of water moving steadily beside them set an easy rhythm to their steps. They talked about childhood summers, about the smell of freshly baked bread, about the little victories that get you through difficult weeks. There was no rush, no edge of expectation. Just two people sharing space and stories. When he held her hand for the first time, it wasn't to pull her close or claim her. It was simply to say, "I'm here." Weeks turned into months. Theo began to meet the twins slowly, joining them for pancake mornings or afternoons at the park. Callan warmed to him first, challenging him to impromptu races, while Sylvie preferred to watch him quietly before offering him one of her stuffed animals as a sign of approval. Theo never tried to replace anything or anyone. He didn't insist on being called anything special. He was just there, helping Callan fix the chain on his toy car, letting Sylvie braid his hair, listening to their stories with genuine interest. Elara noticed how he spoke to them the same way he spoke to her, with attention, with patience, with the kind of respect children remember long after the moment has passed. One Saturday evening, the four of them sat in a blanket fort the twins had built in the living room. Theo was reading aloud from one of their storybooks, doing all the voices, and Elara caught herself watching him with a quiet certainty, not the dizzy rush she once thought love was, but the steady warmth she had learned it should be. If you believe in second chances at love, hit that like button. Let's flood the comments with hope. The cafe was a place she visited often, a quiet spot on the corner where the twins could color while she caught up on design sketches. 6 years had passed since she had walked away from Kai, and life had long since settled into a rhythm she loved. That afternoon was no different. Callan and Sylvie sat at their usual table by the window, crayons scattered between them, their small voices humming over the sound of milk being steamed behind the counter. Elara sipped her tea and made notes in her planner, thinking ahead to a client meeting later in the week. The door opened, and the faint chime of the bell barely caught her attention until she looked up. Kai. For a moment it felt as if the years folded in on themselves. His hair was shorter now, streaked faintly at the temples. The sharpness in his face had deepened, though something in his eyes seemed tired, almost uncertain. He stopped when he saw her. His gaze drifted to the children at her table. "They're mine," he said quietly. Elara's hand stilled on her cup. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. "Yes," she replied evenly. "But they're not yours to raise." For a moment, neither of them moved. The sound of the espresso machine filled the space between them. He stepped closer. "I made mistakes," he began, his voice low. "I was selfish, blind. I thought I could have everything and not lose anything." She held his gaze, but the words didn't pierce her the way they once might have. Time had built a wall between them, not of anger but of clarity. Kai lowered himself into the chair across from her, his hands clasped on the table as if holding something fragile. "I think about it every day," he said. "What I did. What I threw away. Ariane and I. It didn't last. It was over before I even understood what I'd done." Elara didn't look away, but she didn't lean in either. "You understood," she said softly. "You just didn't care enough in that moment." His jaw tightened. "I cared. He stopped, shook his head. "No, I chose wrong. I was chasing something I thought I wanted, and I didn't realize I was destroying what mattered most." She glanced toward the twins. Callan was showing Sylvie how to blend two crayon colors, their heads bent together. "They've had a good life," she said. "Safe, loved. I've made sure of that." "I should have been there," he murmured. "You should have," she agreed. "But you weren't. And we built something without you. It's not missing anything." He swallowed hard, his eyes searching hers for something. Maybe a door left open. Maybe a chance. "I'm sorry, Elara," he said. "More than I can put into words." She nodded once. "I believe you." A flicker of hope crossed his face before she added, "But that doesn't change what's true. I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I won't carry this weight anymore. Forgiveness is for me, not for us." For a long moment, the only sound between them was the scratching of crayons on paper. Finally, Kai leaned back in his chair, as if the air had gone out of him. When she stood, he didn't follow. He simply watched her walk toward the door, the two children gathering their drawings as they hurried to her side. The late afternoon sun spilled across the street as Elara stepped out of the cafe, holding the door open for the twins. Callan bounded ahead, waving a folded drawing in the air like a flag. Sylvie clutched hers close to her chest, careful not to smudge the colors. Across the road, Theo stood by the car, one hand in his pocket, the other holding two small paper cups. The sight of him there, steady, patient, unhurried, washed over her like a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Mom!" Callan shouted, racing toward him. Theo crouched down to meet him halfway, letting the boy barrel into his arms. Sylvie followed, slower but no less certain, slipping her free hand into his as soon as she reached him. Theo looked up at Alara. There was no question in his eyes, no silent demand to know what had happened inside, just an unspoken understanding, the kind that comes from knowing when to ask and when to simply be there. She crossed the street, the warmth of the sun catching in her hair, the sound of traffic fading into the background. When she reached them, Theo handed her the coffee. Hot, with just a touch of cinnamon, he said. Her lips curved into a small smile. You remembered. Always, he replied. They began walking together, Callan chattering about the game he'd invented with crayons, Sylvie slipping her drawing into Theo's jacket pocket for safekeeping. The sidewalk stretched ahead, dappled with light filtering through the trees, the kind of light that makes ordinary moments feel like they might stay with you forever. Alara glanced at Theo as he listened intently to Callan's story, nodding at every twist in the tale as if it were the most important thing he'd hear all day. Sylvie's small hand rested in his, swinging gently in rhythm with their steps. She realized, in that quiet moment, that love wasn't the grand gesture she had once thought it was. It wasn't about being swept away by charm or impressed by success. Real love was this, someone showing up day after day, with no conditions and no performance. Someone who made the ordinary feel like it was enough. The sting of the cafe encounter was still there, but it no longer held her. The past was just that, past. Ahead of her was a life she had built piece by piece, surrounded by the people who had earned their place in it. As they turned the corner toward home, the late sun stretched their shadows long across the pavement. She felt the weight she'd carried for years loosen, replaced by something lighter, steadier. She tightened her hold on Theo's hand. He glanced down at her, and in his small, knowing smile, she saw the answer to a question she hadn't realized she'd been asking. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe and share it with someone who needs courage today. As the days passed after that afternoon at the cafe, Alara found herself thinking less about what had been lost and more about what had been found. There was no rush to erase the past. It had shaped her after all, but she no longer let it define the path ahead. She had once believed that love alone could hold a life together. Now she understood that love without trust is like a house built without a foundation. It might stand for a while, but the first real storm will take it apart. Trust had been broken beyond repair, and she had chosen not to rebuild on the same ground. There was a time when she measured her worth by the presence of those she loved, especially Kai. Walking away had shown her something different, that the truest measure of worth is how you rise when the people you counted on are no longer there. She had built a life not just for herself but for her children on her own terms. That was a kind of wealth no one could take from her. Forgiveness had played its part, but not in the way people often imagined. It wasn't an invitation back into her life, nor was it a sign that she had forgotten the pain. It was a release, a decision to free herself from the hold his choices once had over her. Forgiveness, she realized, was never about giving someone permission to hurt you again. It was about reclaiming the peace they had disturbed. Theo had taught her another truth. The right person will never make you fight for a place in their world. With him, there were no battles for attention, no games to keep him close. He showed up because he wanted to, not because she demanded it. He chose her every day without hesitation, and that choice was worth more than any grand gesture. Looking back, she could see that not all endings are tragedies. Sometimes the happy ending isn't going back to what you had, but moving forward into something better, something honest, steady, and real. Her story hadn't followed the path she once imagined, but it had led her somewhere she felt at home, surrounded by love that asked for nothing in return except the chance to give it back. As she watched Callan and Sylvie playing in the living room one quiet evening, Theo beside her on the couch, she felt a deep certainty settle in her heart. They had all found their own version of happily ever after, and it had come, not from holding on, but from letting go.